Good morning. My name is Jamie Fogo, and welcome to the Naval Historical Foundation's second Saturday webinar for March 2021. I'm proud to have joined the Naval Historical Foundation Board of Directors recently, and between graduating from Annapolis and joining the board, I had almost 40 years of service in our United States Navy. Although I had some remarkable duties ashore with some incredible command opportunities, my most rewarding tour was at sea in command of the Los Angeles class submarine USS Oklahoma City. So right now, for personal reasons, I want to give a big shout out to the commanding officer, chiefs, and crew of USS Oklahoma City, home ported in Apra, Guam. You guys are doing a great job. Keep it up. Underway on nuclear power. Proved to be a game changer in naval warfare. Starting with the Nautilus in 1954, your Navy now had the ultimate predatory weapon system. And in developing the capability to launch ballistic missiles from beneath the surface, nuclear-powered submarines also became the third leg of what is known as the triad of strategic weapon systems that were deployed to deter a nuclear weapon attack on the United States of America. And this leg of the triad remains the most secure to this day and will remain the most secure with the arrival of the Columbia-class submarine, a magnificent design in the next few years. So we want to keep that on track. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover is credited as the father of the Navy's nuclear propulsion program. He's a man who served as the director of naval reactors, where I spent 2 years of my life, for well over 3 decades. With my retirement from active duty, the current director of naval reactors, my classmate, my company mate, Admiral Frank Caldwell, is the last remaining officer on active duty who had the pleasure, like me, of being interviewed by the kindly old gentleman. The kindly old gentleman, of course, Admiral Rickover. He wasn't necessarily always kind. When you went in for that interview, your heart was palpitating and your blood pressure was up, but I would not have traded that experience for anything, my time with him. What made Admiral Rickover legendary was that he was a stickler for details. He was a perfectionist, and that was what was required if civilian authorities, our Congress, was going to authorize and appropriate resources, money, to ensure the operations of our nuclear-powered warships, not just submarines, but nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, and back in the day, nuclear-powered cruisers all over the world. And these magnificent ships had to show a keen safety record. With Rickover's emphasis on safe reactor operations, we're now approaching 7 decades of operating our nuclear reactors at sea flawlessly. Today, approximately half of the nuclear reactors operated by the United States are operated by the Navy. It's a great legacy that I was proud to be part of. Now, unfortunately, during the 1960s, when our Navy was transitioning from diesel submarines from World War II and early Cold War vintage nuclear-powered submarines, we lost 2 of our attack submarines. Sadly, the USS Thresher on April 10th, 1963, with a loss of 129 souls on board, and the USS Scorpion, May 22nd, 1968, likewise with the loss of 99 souls on board. To afford us a better understanding of the circumstances behind the loss of Thresher, and to provide additional closure to the families of those we lost during that past year, the United States Navy has released to the public hundreds of pages of material from the Court of Inquiry held in the wake of the tragic loss of Thresher. Today, we are going to offer an exclusive presentation revealing for the first time in a public forum the events leading up to the loss of Thresher. As always, we welcome your questions and comments and look forward to your participation. Now I'm pleased to turn over our program to our Executive Director, Admiral Sonny Massa. Sonny, over to you.
Thank you, Admiral Fogo, and congratulations on your retirement after 39 years of outstanding service to our Navy and nation. You are a most welcome addition to our Foundation Board of Directors. As Admiral Fogo noted, today will be one of our more solemn second Saturdays as we review the circumstances around the loss of the Thresher on April 10th, 1963, a most tragic day in naval history. We're going to open the program with a fast-paced technical presentation given by Captain Jim Bryant, a 1971 graduate of the United States Naval Academy and past contributor to our Second Saturday program. In the past, he would take on the task of relentlessly pursuing all the data that existed about this tragedy. What he will share with you in just a few minutes is all the new information previously released. At the end of his remarks, an expert panel has been assembled to take your questions. Jim, over to you.
Welcome to the Second Saturday webinar of the Naval Historical Foundation. Today we're going to talk about the loss of the USS Thresher, and we're going to be using material the Navy has recently released and declassified. I'm speaking for myself, not in official capacity. All the information is from open sources, and I can't vouch for the accuracy of these open sources. Here's some terms we're going to use in this brief. Let me explain a couple that are important. Motor generators are rotating machinery that convert direct current to alternating current or alternating current to direct current. That's important because the submarine has, see down here, has ship service turbine generators that produce alternating current from reactor steam. We have a Naval Court of Inquiry, we call it the court. It's convened after you have an accident like this, a loss of a ship. Thresher sank in April of '63. The court was convened the next day. It was the first truly effective anti-submarine warfare platform the Navy had. They were very excited about this. It sank during a routine scheduled deep dive test after a period in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. It was the first and worst nuclear submarine disaster. Remains the worst, the number of lives lost. And until a few months ago, there were only 19 pages of testimony released out of the over 1,700. Let's thank the Navy. They've done a good job of not maximizing the reductions. We're probably still going to challenge them on a few of the reductions, but we found no surprises so far and don't expect to find surprises like smoking guns. Here's some of the things that we learned, a summary of what we've learned. The root cause of this whole problem, this disaster, is the dangers of a much deeper diving submarine not being appreciated in the fabrication, repair, and quality assurance. These were all improving while Thresher was being built, but they were not in place when Thresher was being built. The deep dive test was not done well. There was an emergency repulsion procedure that was not used, that Rickover talks about, Admiral Rickover. And the most important thing is the nuclear power program survived, nuclear propulsion program. There were 28 nuclear submarines in service when Thresher was lost, and 36 more either being built or being planned. And many of them were ballistic missile submarines that were our only means of countering the Soviet nuclear anti-CBM threat. The Navy considers some operations of U.S. submarines about 800 feet classified. That includes stories about the chopper in 1969. Open literature says went to 1,000 feet. Thresher's test depth in open literature is 1,300 feet, and that's what we use. It's important because it's almost twice the test depth of the previous submarines built after World War II, which was 700 feet, which is declassified. Short history of Thresher. The month that Thresher's keel was laid, the previous class lead ship of the previous class of nuclear submarine was being launched. This tells you how fast we were building submarines to counter the Soviet threat. Important point is before going into an overhaul at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, all lead ships get a shock test to verify they can withstand combat damage. Another important factor is about 3 months before the sea trials, both the commanding officer and the executive officer were transferred. Here is a picture of the commanding officers of Thresher. On the right is Rear Admiral D. Naxine. He's a commander then, shaking the hands of his relief, Lieutenant Commander John West Harvey. Test and collapse depth are important for you to understand. The only way you can test the pressure hull of the submarine and the cabling that goes outside the pressure hull for sonar, antennas, navigation lights is to go to its test depth. And for Thresher, we tied it at 1,300 feet. The way you test all the internal piping systems, the seawater piping systems, is by pressuring it to collapse depth. That's 150% of test depth. Thresher is an improved skipjack class. They had the same great reactor system, S5W reactor. It was more powerful, it was easier to maintain, easier to operate, more reliable than the previous reactors the Navy was operating in submarines. It had a teardrop-shaped hull for greater underwater performance. Its control surfaces were moved from the bow of the ship to the fairwater. You can see up here in the picture. And it was the most effective anti-submarine warfare platform in the world because of these features that were built into it. Sound quality and barriers. Submarines before this had a torpedo room in the bow compartment. And that would interfere with first being noisy up near the sonar and a large spherical active passive sonar in the bow and a large conformal low frequency array. It was moved to the center of the ship. These sonars fed the first computer fire control system for submarines. They even developed a steam air conditioning plant, lithium bromide, to replace the R12 piston-driven rock crushers. When you spend some time on this diagram, you see the sonar sphere in the bow. We want a teardrop-shaped hull for greater underwater speed. To do that, we've necked down the pressure hull shown in the dark line to allow main ballast tanks to fit in and fare in with the pressure hull around the bow compartment, around the machinery space, and here back in the stern area. The main ballast tanks are open to the ocean. There's grates in the bottom. They have hydraulically operated vent valves on top. When you're on the surface, they're full of air. When you want to submerge, you open the vents and you fill the main ballast tanks with water, and the submarine loses its 760 long tons of reserve buoyancy. When the submarine submerges, it tries to keep at a neutral buoyance. That means when the submarine slows, it will not go up, will not go down. It's as close as possible to being neutral, will stay in the same place. The red are tanks called the variable ballast tanks. They are served by this trim pump in the machinery space. The trim pump pumps water from sea to them, from them to sea and between them. And the tanks at either end keep the submarine on a neutral trim. Thresher was heavier than the previous skipjack class to fit in heavier and bigger to fit in all the sound quieting features. They wanted it to be fast too, that was important. So they looked for ways to reduce appenage drag. Primary was that reducing the size of the sail, very small sail. And you can see the torpedo tube outer doors coming out instead of the bow, they're coming out toward the center of the ship. A lot of configuration changes made during this 9-month overhaul period. They made the pressure hull stronger. That's because nuclear submarines went to test depth more times than diesel submarines did. They replaced a lot of things, including a very nasty synthetic hydraulic oil called sail lube. It used to melt the shoes of sailors, put in regular petroleum-based oil. There was a lot of damage from the shock test. It was kind of a severe shock test, and they were finding that up to just a couple of weeks before she went on sea trials. This is a picture of Puff's installation on the USS Pogey. Pogey is the next class of submarine, the 637 class. The 7-blade screw you see here was not on Thresher. Previous Thresher's day, submarines used 5-bladed, they called them speed screws. Okay, what I've got circled here is the Puff sonar array attached to the horizontal stabilizer that also has the stern plane controls on it. Another Puff's hydrophone array was in the midships ballast tanks that I showed you. In order to do this, required a lot of rearranging of stuff. For all the rearranging of piping and air flasks, it made it the most, the biggest job the shipyard had. The court did not have any survivors, of course, and there were no electronic recordings. The sound surveillance system that recorded the sounds of Thresher during her deep dive and implosion were all recorded on paper. Underwater telephone communications were not recorded by tape. It was all witnesses in a very poor log. And lots of other people testified. Here's a picture of Skylark, the escort ship, a submarine rescue vessel. And on the left, its underwater telephone, both on Skylark and Thresher. This is not radio. This is much more harder to operate than radio. The ocean provides reverberation, distortion. You get noises of sea life, noises of the other ships. It's a difficult thing, lots of repeats back. Bruce Rule is important because he was the SOSUS analysis officer in Norfolk, and he was assigned to brief the Navy Court of Inquiry on the detections made by SOSUS. And after he did that, he had a long career in acoustic intelligence for the Navy. And in 2017, he finally decided to write a book. I've known Bruce for a long time. We talked about Thresher for a long time, and finally decided it was time to tell all. Information in this book at the time was classified. Now much of it has been released. He told us things like Thresher collapsed at 2,400 feet, imploded, and that she didn't go above 12 knots, or SOSUS would have detected it. Here's how SOSUS work. You spread the hydrophone arrays on the continental slope. They're at the right depth to receive sound from submarines. That information is cabled up to a naval facility where it is processed. Here's a picture of all the naval facilities processing SOSUS array data in the East Coast. You can see up here in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, had an array that was very close to where Thresher was sunk. Antigua, and it recorded fast-speed main coolant pumps. More about that later. Antigua array down here got the best recording of the implosion of Thresher. That was 1,300 miles away. Thresher came out of Portsmouth Naval Shipyard on the morning of 9 April. She went out and met with a Skylark in the Gulf of Maine. The Gulf of Maine is a good place to do a shallow dive, which they did, and some initial testing, because it's less the depth that Skylark can recover the crew from. They did a shallow dive testing and then proceeded out across the continental shelf into the water greater than 8,000 feet for the deep dive test. The SOSUS recorded Thresher coming down this canyon just to the northwest of the array. And when Thresher imploded and sank, that site was only 30 nautical miles from the array, and that's a very short distance for SOSUS. Lots of things contributed to the loss of Thresher. A lot of it was they were still designing submarines like they did diesel submarines. There were long runs of seawater piping. When you flushed the toilet, you were using sea pressure directly from sea. That could be really exciting if you've got 600-pound water at test depth. A very good crew, an excellent crew, but they lacked operational training. In the first bullet, you can see the officers were not well experienced. The new commanding officer and executive officer have been trained by naval reactors in the classroom on the new S5W reactors, but they had not served on a submarine with those reactors. Fast crew is a very important thing to get ready for sea trials. What you do is you're supposed to do this simulated cruise hooked fast to the pier. That means you take all the shore power off, you take everything off, you rig the ship for dive, you operate on the reactor and pretend like you're at sea. Well, this didn't happen on this fast cruise. There were shipyard workers on board for part of it. There were lots of problems that they couldn't do a lot of the training with material, things breaking. They had to stop the fast cruise after 2 days because they had a major failure in an air reducers. One of the problems they had was unfamiliarity with systems. They had a simulated flooding from an auxiliary seawater system. It took the crew 20 minutes to find and isolate that, primarily because they were not familiar with the way the valves had been distributed after the puff installation. The chief engineer wanted to extend the fast cruise a bit to do some more engineering drills for engineering people. That did not happen. They had limited training tools. They didn't have a ship control trainer or the damage control trainers, as you can see on right, that are present today. The information books that had the changes during the overhaul were not provided yet. There was no guidance on the safe operating envelope. If you're going very fast near at test depth and you have a flooding problem, being fast is good because you can get up quickly. But if you have the stern planes jammed and dive, then that's not good. And the same if you're going very, very slow and you have flooding, it's hard to recover. So there was no guidance on what the proper speed would be for safety at various depths. There were lots of failures in silver braze piping. We could hydrostatically test it, but that did not check to see if the bonding was correct and it was going to not leak on you. An ultrasonic test was developed in early '62. Remember, she went into the overhaul in August of that year. They couldn't measure the bonding. They tested all the joints that were open, but they only a few of the joints that were not worked. Delays, some of this required you to remove interference, cut open installation on the piping. And you can see with the lower bullet, there were about 400 joints that would have failed that bonding test. The class was not really designed with the idea that you had to recover from a casualty deep. That kind of study did not even start until the summer that Thresher went into that overhaul period. This study learned that we had a very short time to react, and that's why the blow rate was more important, to get water out of the ballast tanks so that you could keep a positive buoyancy. But the blow rate had not changed since the Nautilus. They didn't understand that was an important design feature. And they even found out that a jammed and dive was a more dangerous casualty. On the picture on the left is an air flask on the bottom from Thresher after she sank. These air flasks were combined into banks in the ballast tanks. The design, the capacity of these air banks was absolutely World War II. The center bullet shows that is just not what not designed for a casualty. Air bank pressure was increased, but because they wanted to stay with the same 3,000-pound air system they've been used in all submarines since World War II, they had to reduce that pressure down to 3,000 pounds. The big issue here is if you had a negative buoyancy problem at test depth, near test depth, from flooding, you were too heavy, if you needed to get up, you had to use nuclear propulsion because there was no backup. Now, the two most common ways of losing propulsion would be a stern plane's jam. If the stern plane makes you go down and you go any speed at all, you're just going to go down further with a deeper angle. And if you have an automatic reactor shutdown, that is because the procedures at the time, after a scram, as we call it, is to secure steam supply to the engine room. That loses your ability to produce AC current through the steam turbines, and you lose propulsion to compensate for a small leak. But it was not even tested below very shallow depths and not tested for long blows. The way that system was used was to surface, do a short main ballast tank blow at periscope depth, get up high enough, use a low pressure blower to blow all the water out of the main ballast tanks. The Navy's given us a lot of new information, and they tell us that the main coolant pumps were in fast speed during this deep dive. That was not a good idea. This is a graph of depth versus time. Time across the top in minutes and depth on the left in feet, developed from the underwater telephone log. This is a 2-hour deep dive. They had a 2-hour and a 6-hour deep dive schedule. The question is, why do both? This was a quick hydrostatic test. While the 6-hour deep dive, we tested a lot more things. You went down much slower, and a much better chance of finding a problem before the problem finds you. There was not a lot of time spent on this, on this deep dive. The Navy has finally told us that main coolant pumps have two speeds, fast and slow. They tell us that the flank speed, the maximum speed of the submarine requires fast speed main coolant pumps, but fast speed main coolant pumps also require a lot of power. They require steam turbine generators. And if those turbine generators stop and the pumps are not shifted to slow in time, then you have a reactor scram. Slow speed pumps are more reliable. You can't go as fast, but they're powered by either the steam turbine generators or the ship's battery, which produces direct current through the motor generators, AC current, because they require less power. There was no guidance on how to do a deep dive back then. In Axine's first testimony, he said that you had to have main coolant pumps and fast speed because he wanted an immediate acceleration to get up shallow. But by his third testimony, he was telling everybody the slow speed pumps were preferred. It sounds to me like somebody talked to him. Slow speed pumps are more reliable, and they have very little advantage. There's little advantage over fast speed main coolant pumps because the slow speed pump provides you enough speed to get shallow quickly. And the court did a recommendation actually on what the first guidance for a deep dive. A moderate speed, which we talked about earlier, these bullets, and most dependable lineup, which main coolant pumps in slow speed. Everyone now agreed with that. Rules 2017 book, so there's a slow variation in main coolant pumps over this time period for 2 minutes. That looks to us like they're isolating a leak, water spraying from a main seawater system, and in doing that, they're limiting the flow to the main condensers, which causes a drop in vacuum, which would decrease the speed of the turbine generators and decrease the speed of the directly coupled main coolant pumps. Main coolant pumps stopped at 0911. Rule is sure they stopped. The court appears to have bought that they stopped. There was a scram and there was no effective backup. They tried a 90-second blow right after 0909, which looks to me like that even though the court did not talk about that in open session, it looks like that happened. That means the slow speed main coolant pump could have been talked about without the recorder present. And right after that main ballast tank blow was started, the commanding officer changed course to Skylark's course. This is standard safety course, standard servicing procedure. If you're on the same course as the escort vessel, there's very little chance of you having a collision. The commanding officer expected the submarine to surface. Some interesting statements here at 913. Minor difficulties. I don't really think so, and I'll show you that. Have positive up angle. Attempting to blow, we agree with that because the blow is being interrupted. There's another 30-second blow, and then a comment on underwater telephone that might have been exceeding test depth. That's probably not correct. And then at 900 north, they believe below 400 feet, all the references to depth were referenced to test depth. So this appears to be 900 feet above or below test depth, but it's got to be, the physics say it's got to be below test depth, 2,200 feet. And then hull collapse at 0918, 24 seconds, 450 feet below collapse depth. Portsmouth built a very strong hull. Here's another depth versus time graph, concentrated. This assumes that the propulsion was lost on a scram. Here you see at 913, we're going deep. I don't think it's a minor difficulty. It's when you've lost propulsion and you're sinking. And then we talk about passing test depth. Well, if that was true, they had to really go really fast downward in order to get to the implosion depth. That very well could have meant passing collapse depth. In 917, 900 north, 2,200 feet works for that. 400 feet does not work with that. Here's a different calculation. This time we take a look at, we assume 2,200 feet and 917 is correct, and the implosion time and depth are correct. And you work that back into a curve, and it ends up joining the test depth at a few minutes before the actual scram. So that indicates she was below test depth. That could have been a jam dive. That's just my guess. We're working on these graphs, and these are just an initial cut at them, thanks to Fred Best. Why the blow didn't surface? Well, Tenosa was a new construction submarine getting ready for sea trials. The court ordered a test of the blow on Tenosa, but we don't have all the data on that. We don't have the exhibit on that. The testimony we see is that the blow test ran for 30 seconds and then stopped because of the freezing of these strainers. Axine testified that deep ballast had 10% of the main ballast tanks. Obviously, that means you had to equalize pressure in the air banks with the main ballast tank pressure. And obviously, this amount of water was not taken out of the ballast tanks. The strainers on the right are from Captain Zach Pate. He was an auxiliary division officer, a lieutenant at the time on Tenosa. He blamed these for freezing up and preventing airflow. And we know that and he did not know these existed, while the Thresher didn't know they existed because they kept filling up with debris and they kept destroying these air reducing valves. There were two of these air reducing valves in parallel. And they did not want these strainers removed before sea trials as they were supposed to be, because they considered the system still too dirty and multiple failures. Remember, one of these failures of these valves caused the stopping of the fast cruise. And although we don't have detailed testimony on it, the main ballast tank flow was interrupted and failed due to restrictions in flow and freezing. Admiral Rickover was the director of Naval Nuclear Repulsion. He was a vice admiral at the time. He talked about some interesting things here. The court president, another vice admiral, asked him, of course, the reactor had no problem with the loss of Thresher. This is a public affairs because no one really knew that. I mean, you had no real data on that, but it was important because we had to maintain the nuclear power program, right? He was asked, there was no radioactive contamination, right, Admiral Rickover? And of course he said no, and he had a public statement. Well, that's because the public had been inundated for years about how radiation made monsters like Godzilla. My favorite movie was Them, about the giant ants in Arizona. These are quotes from Rickover on the right, that find in testimony. He's talking about an emergency repulsion procedure where you leave the steam to the engine room and you use it to run the main engines for a few minutes, long enough to get yourself to the surface. When a reactor shuts down, you don't lose all the heat from it. The fission products continue to decay and produce some decay heat after the reactor is shut down. And he says the ship could have got to the surface if they had done that. Also, Rick over here appears to admit that there's a lot of unofficial communications not being recorded by the court recorder that talked about this problem, this issue. I've talked to a couple of lawyers, and if it goes into the court record, you can't remove it. I suspect Rickover would have wanted that information removed. Information on the USS George Washington comes to me from a good source. He was a junior officer on the George Washington, and he became a squadron commander and commanded a prototype unit. He says that the commanding officer, before Thresher was lost on George Washington, had a standing order. And this commanding officer was Captain Jim Osborne, and he is on the Naval Court of Inquiry. And he says they had the procedure and that Rickover knew about it, and Rickover said it was okay. There was no explanation of why Thresher or all submarines did not have a similar. George Washington was a 700-foot boat. The Thresher class was a 1,300-foot boat. But I'm sure Rickover explained this to the board, but we don't know what it is because it was not captured by the court recorder. Rickover promised a faster recovery from a scram. And by just keeping steam to the engine room, you can see by the first bullet, it creates a lot of shortcut, cuts out a lot of time. Rickover also mentions a faster reactor startup procedure, does not describe it. Rickover did defend his program. Nuclear submarines were critical in national security during the Cold War. The fiercest critics of Rickover were the diesel submarine guys, the diesel submarine mafia. Diesel submarines had a great part in defeating Japan through very daring, courageous, almost foolhardy means. They did a lot of damage to the Japanese. Now these officers were not being taken into the nuclear power program. Only a few of them. You had commanding officers like Lucky Flucky on the Barb, who sent a shore party ashore to blow up a Japanese train. Rickover did not want these extreme risk takers, not procedure following people to operate his reactor plants, because he knew a major reactor accident or radiological incident could very well cause the loss of the program. Rickover does some of his Rickover magic and diverts attention away from his program. He looked at blaming the steel, HY80, for cracking and wanted to go back to the old steel. Experts were brought out that showed that was not really right, that steel was correct. The court report actually mentions that main coolant pumps could have been shifted to slow, even though that report is written like they were stopped. That appears to be, to us, a Rickover ploy to again shift attention. We know they had an up angle at 0913. If the pumps were in slow, they wouldn't have scrammed, they would have gone to the surface. Rickover's statement on the left is very true. You listen to all the witnesses and talking about it, they were proud, they were skilled technicians, they were dedicated, but the court documented that they just didn't have the procedures, fabrication, quality assurance. They had a hard time proving in the court that the auxiliary seawater system had been hydrostatically tested. There were obviously concerns of delay because they wanted to get this best ASW platform, auxiliary anti-submarine warfare platform out to sea. And the base cause is much deeper diving submarine was not appreciated. Rickover promised a faster recovery from a scram. And by just keeping steam to the engine room, you can see by the first bullet, it creates a lot of shortcut, cuts out a lot of time. Rickover also mentions a faster reactor startup procedure, does not describe it. Rickover did defend his program. Nuclear submarines were critical in national security during the Cold War. The fiercest critics of Rickover were the diesel submarine guys, the diesel submarine mafia. Diesel submarines had a great part in defeating Japan through very daring, courageous, almost foolhardy means. They did a lot of damage to the Japanese. Now these officers were not being taken into the nuclear power program. Only a few of them. You had commanding officers like Lucky Flucky on the Barb, who sent a shore party ashore to blow up a Japanese train. Rickover did not want these extreme risk takers, not procedure following people to operate his reactor plants, because he knew a major reactor accident or radiological incident could very well cause the loss of the program. Rickover does some of his Rickover magic and diverts attention away from his program. He looked at blaming the steel, HY80, for cracking and wanted to go back to the old steel. Experts were brought out that showed that was not really right, that steel was correct. The court report actually mentions that main coolant pumps could have been shifted to slow, even though that report is written like they were stopped. That appears to be, to us, a Rickover ploy to again shift attention. We know they had an up angle at 0913. If the pumps were in slow, they wouldn't have scrammed, they would have gone to the surface. Rickover's statement on the left is very true. you listen to all the witnesses and talking about it. They were proud, they were skilled technicians, they were dedicated, but the court documented that they just didn't have the procedures, fabrication, quality assurance. They had a hard time proving in the court that the auxiliary seawater system had been hydrostatically tested. There were obviously concerns of delay because they wanted to get this best ASW platform, auxiliary anti-submarine warfare platform out to sea. And the base cause is much deeper diving submarine was not appreciated. As you can see from my bullet above, I have experience on Thresher class submarines, and I've been studying the loss of Thresher since about 2017. Steve Walsh is going to be on the line to answer questions. He spent a lot of years as a naval architect working for the Navy on submarines. Fred Best helped us with some calculations on some graphs. We'll show you those in part of the presentation. And Nick is a master of slides and helping me correct errors. Pictures of 129 lives lost. Here's the Harvey family. Here's a picture sent in by some of the families that we talked to. Ben Schaefer was the Master Chief Electrician's mate. He and his brother were lost. He was the most senior enlisted nuclear trained enlisted person on board. And this is from the family. The bottom one, this is Walter Nunes, Chief Radioman. And this concludes my brief.
I wanted to thank our event sponsors, General Dynamics and Applied Mathematics, for their generous contributions to this program. You made it possible, and we thank you very much. I guess my first question goes to the panel, which includes Steve Walsh, a lifelong nuclear engineer from both NAVC-08 and other nuclear-centric codes from NAVC, and the noted author Norman Friedman, who has written on nearly every topic, including a synopsis of naval submarine development from World War II to present. So just asking you all three kind of in a free form, and we have a lot of questions to address. Was there any surprises given that the previous releases of documents were only 19 pages and they're now, several thousand? We'll go to Steve Walsh. What do you think, Steve?
Yes, there were surprises. When the Buse ship's personnel testified, Commander Wolson and Lieutenant Commander Bryan, their testimonies were quite surprising in that they had never done recovery studies on Thresher or any deep diving submarine until a year after Thresher had been commissioned. As a result of that, they really had no good damage control bills or anything else to give them any insight as to how to deal with a casualty when they were at Thresher's much deeper depth. So yes, there were, to answer your questions, Admiral, there were surprises.
And what were your thoughts on this revelation, Mr. Friedman, Dr. Friedman?
Well, the thing that struck me actually was the extent of the overhaul and the way in which post-overhaul work seemed to be rushed. For example, the termination of the fast cruise. You would have thought after the fast cruise didn't work very well that there would have been a second one after some training. And it's obvious that it was very urgent, much more urgent than I would have thought, to get Thresher out to do tactical exercises. Thresher had new equipment on board, new ASW equipment. Puffs is the most obvious. She also had an underwater communication system. She had the first digital fire control system. And you can believe that it was urgent to arrange her presence at some exercises. before she went up north and saw some real Soviets. So I knew about the sense of urgency. I didn't realize what it meant. The other thing is that Mr. Walsh looked back at the crew, and I think he was the one who discovered just how much the crew had been changed. Now, I hadn't realized that neither the CO nor the XO had any experience whatever with very fast nuclear subs. So what you have is a sudden need for training, which is not met. Now, I don't know what the conclusion will be about that, but I tend to look at ships and other things in more mechanical terms, and this dramatizes the human aspect. The mechanical terms make you think that, oh, well, everyone has roughly the same training, but no, they didn't. And that's rather important. I don't know that anyone appreciated just how dangerous that was going to be. Normally, the Navy is very good about, you have to worry about this, you have to worry about that, you have to worry about what will happen if. And it's as though that had been lost somehow. That sense of things can happen. And this was a horrible example of things can happen. And really, that's what everyone has brought out. We don't do recovery studies. Well, what's going to happen to a nuclear sub? It has all this power. It can always get to the surface. Well, and if the power goes out for some reason, now there had been talk about how the deeper diving gave you a greater margin in the event of some emergency. In 1959, there was a good deal of uneasiness in the submarine community about what they thought was a lot of new technology in Thresher. And there was a special meeting of which the transcript exists in the National Archives. Well, they go through the changes in the sub, and they point out that they're really not as radical as you might imagine. And then there's a comment, well, if something goes sour at high speed at operating depth, you have a lot more time to recover from it with Thresher, with a much deeper crush depth than with the previous class. And that was sort of interesting to see. But the assumption that's buried in that is, and you'll have your power to get you out of trouble. And nuclear power plants have proven remarkably reliable up to that point.
Jim Bryan, any thoughts?
Well, to back up at the training issue, they were pushing to get that submarine out. And a large part of the testimony was people saying, no, there was no pressure. But it was obvious that they wanted the submarine out, or they would have, for example, uncovered more of the silver braid joints and tested them. And they spent a lot of manpower on puffs. If that manpower had been spent on going back and correcting some of the deficiencies they knew with building that submarine, I mean, that's a 20/20 hindsight that it could have been avoided.
There was a question about the fact that within 24 hours we have this panel, and we're doing an investigation. Did we bring in the right people? Should we have included Thresher family members? There was some words out there that, some sailors were going home at night saying, I don't know. I think I've got a couple of doubts, or I'm just wondering how this is going to work out. And I don't think anybody, especially in the submarine force, comes to work every day with some sort of fatalistic mentality. But the sophistication of the crew, however untrained they might have been, was such that they might have had concerns. What are your thoughts? They quickly have a board that's convened. Did the right people show up for the board? And did they not invite all the people they should have invited? Over to you, Steve Walsh.
Admiral, the Court of Inquiry actually did take testimony from the brother of Master Chief Schaefer, and apparently there was some concern on his part on the readiness of the ship, both materialistically and possibly training-wise, to get underway. But most of the questions, you could tell by the nature of the questions that were being asked of people that would have been familiar with the crew. Was the crew adequately trained? The Court of Inquiry kind of left that hanging. They said that they were a good crew, which they certainly were, but they didn't come to a bottom line because they didn't have much to go with as far as whether or not the crew was sufficiently trained. And when I was reading the testimony of the CO of the Dogfish, which was a diesel boat that was in at the yard at the time, he was the sublant rep, and the crew certification process back in that particular time frame struck me as being a lot less robust than it is now. So basically, it looked like all he really needed to do was make sure the ship had put together a sea trial agenda, which they did, and then asked the CO did he feel the crew was adequately trained, which apparently the CO indicated in the affirmative. That's not really, as you well know, how things are done these days, but things were a lot more lax back then. And I do believe that, as Dr. Friedman points out, that training crew training was probably not as robust as it could be. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of the feedback that some of the sailors were observing were along those lines, sir.
Yeah, there's kind of an aggregate question that has been asked by 3 or 4 different people, and it's simply this: if you look at studies about shipbuilding, and you look at names of ships that were built after people who were alive and not deceased, you look at Carl Vinson, John C. Stennis, L. Mendel Rivers, Scoop Jackson, or Henry M. Jackson. And you go down the line, Jimmy Carter, and you go down the line and down the line and down the line. Well, who are these people? Well, they were heavily invested in the government of our United States, who heavily funded our shipbuilding efforts. And so we really got to the precipice, it appears, that we're cranking out ships. And what are we looking at in the schedule that Jim showed earlier? Every 90 days, we're commissioning a new boat. So what was this tension? What is there some sort of connection to that? I think we all shake our heads and go, yeah, there had to have been. But what are your specific thoughts on it? Jim Bryant first and Norman Friedman second.
Rickover was very clever. He would take congressmen out to sea. He took him out on the Enterprise. He took him out on submarines. When he went on a sea trials run, he made all the first sea trials of new construction submarines. He always demanded to have a number of letterhead for that submarine, because on the way back in, what he would do, he'd write notes to all the congressmen telling them about how great the sea trials was, and he advertised that fully. He understood he needed funding for his program because it was a very expensive program. So that was part of Rickover's basic philosophy. That's why you also started naming 688s after cities, because fish don't vote.
Roger that. Norman, what are your thoughts?
Well, that's certainly true. You got to remember the time. Quite aside from the fact that the program had a lot of political horsepower behind it, it was a very important national program. Once we had the ballistic missile subs, it wasn't as though some individual thought suddenly, oh, well, this is a good thing to push and I'll get a lot of congressmen to help me. Those ballistic missile subs were a terribly important part of the national deterrent. And also there was a sense within the Navy, which was quite reasonable, that once the Soviets had nuclear subs, we had better be able to sink them, and that nuclear submarines were probably the best way to do that. So Thresher comes at a time of great urgency. And also there's the creation of the ballistic missile subs places enormous stresses on the Navy personnel, because each ballistic missile sub requires 2 crews. So it's not just a matter of a lot more subs, it's twice as many more crews that have to be created. I would bet you that a lot of the personnel transfers out of Thresher between the first CO and the second one had to do with the ballistic missile program. That was incredibly urgent. And there have been people talking about how they had to grow the program much more rapidly than anyone would have liked. And the attack subs were terribly important also. Of course, you name major ships after congressmen who helped the Navy. By the way, they didn't used to. That's a phenomenon of the last, say, 20 years, 30 years. Before that, the Navy thanked people, but they didn't name anything after them. So, for example, there must have been chairmen before Vincent who were incredibly helpful. You never heard of them. They certainly didn't end up on the names of ships. That's a fairly modern phenomenon.
What caused the loss of speed control of the SSTG prior to the full speed MCPS going away? And that'll be for Jim.
Well, this is only a guess. We are guessing. It's the governors on those turbine generators are very solid. And if you get a breaker opening up, you have a short, water sprays into a breaker panel, you get a breaker, you get a short breaker, you get a small spike in the on the voltage. But you know, to get a slow variation, you need something like a change in the vacuum in the condenser. And again, this slow variation did not show up in testimony. It could have, you know, Bruce Rule says he's very positive that was just discussed, but it could have been discussed. And now we know that Rickover was talking to these people, and we only have very small portions of what he said. So this could have been done in a situation where the court recorder was not there. They were in court, maybe, but they didn't have the court in session. And so that's the only thing I can come up with is to cause a slow variation. And then you ask, well, why would the main coolant pump shifted from fast to slow where you would not have gotten the scram? We don't know.
So Paul asks a more direct question, and you know, I think it's the right one. You know, we're talking April 10th, 1963. What took so long? Okay, that was my editorial, you know, part. But he asks, is the story of the failed pipe and seawater spray in the auxiliary machinery space compartment between the reactor compartment and engine room an official Navy cover-up? You know, was that a mistake that, you know, we're just not going to admit to? And your thoughts on that, all of you, really.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Steve, you understand the question?
I think Paul is asking, the Navy Court of Inquiry indicated that they felt that the leak was in the engine room.
Yes.
Paul seems to indicate that it looks like it might have been in the AMS. And Jim, you and I have had many discussions about this. My personal feeling is looking at the wreckage pictures of the ship on the bottom, I think the problem originated in the AMS as well. But that doesn't mean that the Court of Inquiry is wrong. It just means they didn't have the forensic evidence to go by, because their report was released in June, and they didn't actually start finding the ship until late in calendar year 1963. And and more specifically in 1964, when Trieste 2 was making its dives on it during the summer of 64. So basically, I don't know if there was a cover-up. And the other thing that has been explained to me is the Navy very seldom, if ever, goes back and revises a court of inquiry report. So they didn't have the forensics to, as far as the pictures go, to come to their conclusion. But I think Paul Boyne seems to ask a reasonable question. I don't have an answer other than what I just articulated that way.
I have seen nothing that looks like a cover-up.
And that's the key. That's the key right there. Yeah.
I've seen people being protected, which Navy people do in courts of inquiry, and things kind of being de-emphasized, but I don't see a cover-up. Steve, you ought to tell the Harry Jackson story about the trim pump piping and machinery space lower level.
Yeah, I took a submarine design course at MIT in the summer of '88, and Harry Jackson, who'd been the design superintendent for Thresher at Portsmouth back up to the time she was lost, was mentioning that he did a tour of the boat on the evening of the 8th before the boat got underway the next morning. And when he dropped down to the AMS lower level, he noticed that there was an elbow on the trim pump that was misaligned. And he told the class that he was really concerned about that, and enough so that if the ship had had time in its schedule, he would have had that elbow cut out and realigned properly. But there was no time to do that. And he often said during the class, and later on when I got friendly with him, that he often wondered if that hadn't perhaps been a source of their problem.
But you have to recognize, too, that they had underwater telephone communications up to the last 30 seconds before they imploded, which means they had AC power. So you could not have flooded that space, and the motor generators sit right down on either side of the trim pump. So, if there really had been a lot of water running around, they would have gone away, and you wouldn't have had AC power because the reactor was scrammed, and more than likely the steam valves were shut.
Yeah. We've got a pretty austere audience today among our minions that we have, and we love you all. We've got 3 former secretaries of the Navy. We've got the 9th MCPON of the Navy, Jim Hurt. We've got, folks who've dedicated their lives to the submarine service and to the love of the Navy and to finding out the tragedy of these souls that are on eternal patrol. But we've got a couple questions. There's a gentleman, Doug Radosky, asks, are there any plans for more forensic examination of the wreckage or underwater archaeology that you're aware of?
I do not know of any, and also that you get a high sedimentation rate, and when last time you saw pictures of it, Steve, wasn't it pretty much covered?
Thresher was both Thresher and Scorpion were getting covered very quickly. Some of the assets that I was responsible for in the Deep Submergence Office back in '98 dove on both Thresher and Scorpion. The Navy does do periodic surveys on those 2 submarines, and they'll do marine life samples and they'll do bottom samples to see what's going on. And I suspect, Admiral, that the Navy will probably continue to do so. But as Jim articulated, I don't know about any forensics or anything of that nature.
Do you think there should be more research on that, Norman?
I don't think you'll see anything more. From the Navy's point of view, the question is and was what sank the sub. I think that they will feel that the Court of Inquiry went into that rather thoroughly. I doubt that they would go again. Remember that there are no more S-5Ws in service. Remember that there are no more submarines of this design in service. You go back and the suggestion there was some sort of cover-up. There may be differences of opinion as to exactly what happened, but I don't see that if you localize the initial damage to the auxiliary machinery rather than main machinery, I don't see that shows that some evil presence out there that did anything that has to be covered up. That's a difference in interpretation, and the differences of interpretation are everywhere. There are important points that came out very rapidly after Thresher was sunk. There was a sense that the piping design had been very poorly done, and if you add an inexperienced crew to complex piping arrangement, suddenly you understand that leaks would be extremely difficult to handle. And that was understood almost immediately. That was very widely known. I've been told that the Navy submarine community was furious about that. That's why Portsmouth never did a detailed design for a nuclear sub again. That's why SubSafe immediately concentrated on piping within the sub. Not only its integrity, but the ability to shut off everything rapidly. And you see in the Board of Inquiry, the Court of Inquiry rather, the comment that if you got a flooding casualty of any sort and people were unfamiliar with how to isolate it, things could happen extremely rapidly and rather fatally. And that sounds like what happened. So it's not as though someone invented some supernatural cause for this in order to absolve the Navy Yard at Portsmouth or anyone else. I'm very surprised that anyone believes that this has been concealed. There are things we didn't know, but the biggest thing we didn't know is what Steve Walsh uncovered, which is who was in the crew and how much experience they had. That's a tremendous thing, and it overshadows whatever news you get out of reading the Court of Inquiry.
So it's really that tension between, was this a mechanical failure, or was it a combination of a mechanical failure meets a personnel training and readiness failure meets a rapid schedule that doesn't, put some rigor and metrics behind, when you are ready to go to that next level. I guess the follow-on from that is the permit 594 was commissioned. Did it slip? Did it was projected to commission, 90 days later. Was that pushed back as a result of this?
When Thresher was lost, Admiral, permit and plunger were both in service.
Okay.
So basically 3 ships of the class, including Thresher, were in service. And this gets back to what Dr. Friedman was pointing out and what I pointed out to Jim. The training infrastructure for the Navy for this brand new class of deep diving high performance submarine wasn't really very mature. So you had no rotatable pool per se of personnel with a Thresher class experience to draw from. And as Dr. Freeman pointed out, a lot of them were being diverted off of those boats towards the FBMs that were coming online. If you remember correctly, the Lafayette, the 616, delivered roughly 2 weeks after Thresher was lost. So we were building like crazy at the time, and they needed personnel. So yes, there was a limited number of Thresher class available boats, but one of the things the Court of Inquiry did do, and the Navy did in general, was they did put a limitation in depth, a lid on most of those boats until they could get a better handle and start implementing some of the SubSafe, what ended up being SubSafe requirements, which came out of the Court of Inquiry's recommendations.
Yeah, great point. So Lang Keith, calls me out correctly. Am I blaming the crew when it appears the naval reactor procedures or scrams may be the major cause of Thresher's loss? No, I'm absolutely not in any manner, shape, or form. Not that I would blame a crew on any vessel, surface or subsurface, who had a bad day at sea or had something go wrong. It was just was it a contributing factor in a manner of speaking? We had another gentleman who's a real friend of our foundation, George Schimmelfennig from Germany. And his question is really, we talked about it before show airtime today. Who the heck called for the change of command of a CO after 4 months in command and turned it over to Lieutenant Commander John Harvey? Who does that? And we had that was a good dialogue. I think George needs an explanation from you. Why don't we revisit that discussion?
Well,
Go ahead, Steve.
yeah.
You guys are asking the non-operator. I'm a naval architect.
No,
and
all
an
we were
assistant
talking about was that in the desire to roll experience, and of course the new CO did not have any platform experience whatsoever. Why would he in the first ship? But the idea was there was just this urgency to adjust the mix of the talent as fast as quickly possible. And anyway, it strikes me that you've forgotten that discussion, which is okay. So any thoughts though, or I'll go on to the next question.
Jim.
Well, the testimony of the Chief of Naval Personnel, Admiral Smedberg, has not been released yet. And Smedberg and Rickover had big fights because Smedberg put a whole list of very qualified, academically qualified submarine officers up from diesel boats, and Rickover chose very few of them. And there's and this is discussed in the Rickover book, Rickover and the Nuclear Navy, quite a bit. But the testimony should be interesting because I'm sure there will be lots of pointing as to why this happened. And that's not really been discussed yet. It's noted in the findings of fact that this happened and it concerned the board. We don't have the testimony yet. And I suspect there are going to be some fireworks coming up here.
That's interesting.
And they're also going to give us an exhibit that gives us the personnel and officer listings and ratings, if they'll give it to us.
So there's a question by a gentleman named Walt Haskins, never served in the Navy. He's a great American and a champion of our armed forces, and he is a stalwart member of our foundation, a life member of our foundation. And he lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he practices law. And he asked this great question. If blockage of the filters was a known risk, which would incapacitate a critical system, why was there no emergency bypass?
They just didn't use this system. The system was not even considered as a backup. Yeah, if you read testimony, there was a master's thesis done in the late 80s in which all these players, Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Fluckey, all got interviewed. And they said everybody knew that this blow system was useless. And so it was not even tested at any depth besides periscope depth. So, it was not considered to be, a really viable system. So when it was used, it was kind of the Hail Mary. You turn the safety course and you blow because you're sinking and you've lost propulsion and you have nothing else. And it just happened badly for them. No, it was that system was a terribly designed system. That they were using a 400-foot diesel boat blow system, on a 1,300-foot submarine, and without any studies in place to show the recovery rates and the chance of recoveries or anything. And they knew they were taking the risk, but they just kind of, nuclear power was so good, they just went with it.
Remember how reliable nuclear power had proven up to this point. It never broke. You never heard about a nuclear sub that had lost power and had to come home on the diesel engine that they had as a backup. And you never heard about people losing nuclear power and going over to a battery. They had backups for the propulsion. But the idea that you would lose all power I don't think anyone had really imagined that. It was a very, very reliable system.
Yeah, we got a note from Alan Kerr, and he kind of gets back at us a little bit, and I like the interplay there, Alan Kerr. He says Garner had spent 4 years on board the Skate. Schaefer was on the Skipjack before Thresher. Pennington had been at the David Taylor basis, and CPOs had served on nuclear vessels before. How was there a training shortage in our minds? Just wasn't enough, or does he
That's
make
experience? That's experience. They had some experienced people, and for picking Wes Harvey as a CO, I mean, he was a super nuke. He had done lots of great things. He put the prototype in commission. He was the first engineer on Tullabee. But what we're looking at here is a chance for operational training to actually get the crew was a super excellent crew, but they didn't have a chance to get them up to speed. That fast cruise is so critical in getting the crew ready to go on sea trials. You're supposed to be down there dedicating, performing all these evolutions and all these training, and it just did not happen well. And the Admiral Kurtze, who was a Bew ships, testified before Congress on this, and he said that they had put more time in overhauls to allow for training because they recognized there was not time for example, when you steam the engine room using shore steam, once you do the testing. In my day, back in the 70s, they allowed us 3 or 4 days to just train the crew on those systems, starting up and shutting down turbine generators, starting up, bringing the main engines on the line, warming them up, shutting them down, getting all the qual cards. I do not think they allowed that much time during this overhaul period for them to get up to speed and skilled at what they needed to know.
Thank you. So Robert Frick asks a great question. Was there discussion of flooding emergency with SCRAM immediate actions at that time, such as shutting throttles, shutting MS1 and 2? Any thoughts?
What you see is a long discussion about isolating seawater leakage. The philosophy at the time, I believe, is if you have a leak, if it's there's a big discussion, and Rickover got involved in it too. If a wall of water is coming at you, you shut the whole system down. But if it's and there's a lot of discussion about if you shut all the seawater down, what happens to the reactor? You overheat components. Big discussion on that. And the philosophy was kind of, if the leak's not too bad, let's go find it and isolate it. And by the end of the discussion, it was more of, let's shut the whole system down and sort it out later.
Other thoughts, Steve Walsh, Norman?
Yes, the ship, obviously, Dr. Freeman touched on it, and one of the things and Jim has mentioned it, during the testimony indicated that Thresher underwent a significant amount of configuration changes, especially in the engineering spaces. The entire freshwater side of the main condensate system was ripped out and replaced with a brand new system. All the hydraulic system was significantly impacted by puffs, as was the auxiliary freshwater system and the high pressure air. So basically what that tells you is a lot of key valves were put into new positions, or they were outright replaced with some other type of valves. So for example, the ASW system had some check valves put into it so that they could isolate port and starboard loops. As Jim has indicated, we saw very little evidence in the testimony. In fact, we saw evidence that the ship just didn't have time to train. And as a result of that, and I don't want people to think that we're saying that was the cause of the loss. I approached this as with a critique mentality. What were the contributing causes? And certainly crew training was a key contributing cause, but it wasn't the only one. And as a result of that, in my mind, the root cause of the loss of the boat was because there were so many contributing causes. The Navy underappreciated the risk of nearly doubling the test depth of this brand new high performance class of submarine. And there were
I mentioned
a lot of
to the crew that they were going down so fast, right, Steve? They were going down the test depth so rapidly because they were locked into a 2-hour deep dive, and the captain was going to stay on schedule. My thoughts are, if they had just taken a little more time, and they'd found the problems before the problems found them, they would have survived that.
I tend to agree.
I'm going to ask the group to go through one last time any final thoughts that they have, on we got this new information. What did it mean? Did you learn anything? Bottom line, does it make this story tell differently? I'll start with Jim Bryant.
Well, we don't discuss subsafe because that's not really part of this part of the story. But what I personally hope when I started doing this was that now we've got unclassified material that subsafe workers or people interested in studying this can go look at. You don't have to go to a classified reading room or whatever. You can make up your own information books out of the testimony, take it home and read it and study it and use it in the classroom. And I hope that there'll be graduate students out there in engineering who will write master's and PhD theses on this, so we can even get more detail and more understanding. Thank you.
Mr. Walsh.
Expanding on what Jim just said, what came out of this court of inquiry was basically the subsafe program, and it is the legacy to the 129 souls that were lost on this ship. And what this release of information is doing, at least for me, who's worked in the subsafe background and for the last, for the 39 years I was a civilian working for the Navy, is it provides expanded background, and it's very important. I sent Al Konitsny an email earlier, and I said to him, the Navy has done itself a huge favor doing this, because even people like myself that have done this for 39 years learn new things as to why the subsafe attributes are the way they are in some cases, and the importance of things that, as Dr. Friedman pointed out, access to vital as far as key valves, being able to get to them quickly and all. So this really is, as Jim Bryant says, is good training material that should be incorporated into the subsafe training and refresher training that we all used to get around the anniversary of Thresher every year.
Thank you. And Norman, you have the final word.
Well, I don't know how final this is, but when you read the court of inquiry, when you read the detailed testimony, first thing that comes out is how complicated those machinery systems are. There's far more to it than even a very interested layman has any idea. I had no feeling for the different speeds of pumps, for example. That's not the sort of thing you normally discuss. And the more you look, the more important it is to have a very detailed understanding of what's on board that sub. That goes back to the training issue. That goes back to familiarity. If you look at the whole range of things that happen to ships, a lot depends on how familiar everyone is with the ship itself, with the details of valves, piping, and everything else. When there's a disaster, you don't sit back and say, oh, well, I understand that this circuit should go this way instead of this other way. No. You have to know instinctively what to close, where to jump. That comes out in the testimony. And it also comes out if you think about it. And that goes back to the urgency of the situation. Things were urgent at that time because the United States was in a very dangerous situation. The Navy understood that. That's behind all of this. That's why Polaris existed. That's why it was an important thing to get a lot of Polaris submarines into service. That's why ASW submarines were terribly important. And that's a different world than we're in right now. It's a world we can come back to if we're not careful very easily. But under those circumstances, people took chances. There were a lot of people killed in peacetime operations. The crew were casualties of the Cold War, as much as if they'd been shot down by the Russians in a bomber flying near Russia. And that's probably the most honest way to put it. The Cold War was not a benign experience. People got killed protecting this country. And it forced people to take chances which in peacetime, in real peacetime, would be totally unacceptable. There's a reason that that fast cruise was cut short. It had something to do with urgent operational needs, not with somebody's ego or some kind of stupid cover-up. It had to do with what the country badly needed at that time. And I think that that bottom line doesn't come across in the Court of Inquiry because everyone in the Court of Inquiry knew what that was about. They were living it. That's the only thing you gained by being a historian. You look back and you say, oh, well, that was in all their minds. They don't get up and say every day, well, the Russians are nasty and we got to worry about them. They kind of guess that.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that very articulate final word. I had mentioned that the final music was originally composed. That actually started our show. We did not write the Eternal Father, Strong to Save, but we're going to hear that in an homage to the crew. And then one more time, the original music. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, sponsors, GD and Applied Mathematics. Thank you, foundation members. Please join us. If you like this content, join us. And we're going to send it out to you tomorrow on YouTube, and you can go find it. And we find that within a few days, we get about 200 to 300 more people looking in at our content. So please consider being a member. www.navyhistory.org and just join and stay with us and enjoy our content. That concludes our show. Thank you. Over to you, Colin.
Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm doth bind the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea. Lord, guard and guide the men who fly through all great spaces of the sky. Be with them traversing the air in darkening storms and sunlight fair. Oh, hear us when